Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We are a little bit later today because we're not only looking at the weekend box office, but this is our wrap-up show of 2024. So we're going to look at some of the biggest hits and some of the biggest flops of last year, as well as the overall box office picture. And crunching those numbers takes a little bit of extra time, so thanks for your patience. We will get to all of that, but before we do, let's jump into the first box office weekend of 2025. The movies were all holdovers from the previous weekend. No surprise, because studios didn't put out any new movies for the first weekend. But there was a new number one movie, because after winning the Christmas holidays and not quite being the number one film due to quirks of scheduling and earnings and everything else, Mufasa the Lion King has finally grabbed the box office crown. It is the first box office champion of the new year. It made $23.4 million, a 36.3% drop from the previous weekend, and it narrowly beat out by a couple $1 million Sonic the Hedgehog 3, which had actually captured the number one crown for the past 2 weekends, even though Mufasa was the number one movie on Christmas Day and for much of the holidays. Sonic came in at $21.3 million, a 42.3% drop. Its domestic total is now at $187.6 million. And again, this is why when both of the movies opened, I said you can't really pass judgment as far as which movie's going to make more, or is Mufasa a flop, is it not a flop? Because the Christmas box office, the holiday box office, is so weird sometimes in how it acts. We had with Sonic 3, a movie that was number one for 2 weekends in a row, but may end up being outgrossed by Mufasa, depending on how both of these movies leg out over the next few weeks. So Mufasa is at number one. Nosferatu stays at number 3. It was actually the only movie in the top 5. These are the same top 5 movies, but Nosferatu is the only one that stayed in the same spot. It dropped 39.5% in its second weekend. That's good for a horror film, and a horror film that is somewhat divisive with general audiences. It brought in $13 million. Its domestic total is now at just under $70 million. Moana 2 and Wicked switched places. Moana 2 is at number 4. It dropped 34.1% and brought in $12.4 million. Wicked came in 5th place. It dropped 49.5%. Probably a combination of the fact that it added theaters for Christmas with the sing-along version, and the fact that it's now available to watch at home on premium video on demand. Its domestic total is now at $450 million. Both of those movies, very big successes. Numbers 6 through 10 are actually a complete replication of what we saw last weekend. A Complete Unknown is in 6th place. It dropped 29.8%. It brought in another $8 million for a $41.8 million total. This is very interesting to me. Baby Girl from A24 stays in 7th place, but it almost duplicated the previous weekend's gross exactly. It made $2,354 more dollars in weekend 2 than it did in weekend 1, which is an increase of 0.05%. Honestly, in all the time that I've been doing this show, I can't think of a movie that so closely replicated the previous weekend, which means a couple of things. Number one, a word on the street, obviously, about Baby Girl is positive, or at least telling people that they have to go see it. Not surprising, because the movie does some pretty nutty stuff. And also, this is a movie that wasn't front-loaded. There were plenty of people who didn't rush out to see it right after Christmas that decided to go over the first weekend of the new year. But still, that is really, $2,354, that gap is crazy. Its total now is $16.1 million. Gladiator 2 is at number 8. It brought in $2.6 million. Homestead is in 9th place at just over $2 million. And The Fire Inside rounds out the top 10 with $1.1 million. And I was talking about Sonic 3 and Mufasa. These are their daily grosses. Again, this is not cumulative gross. This is how much each movie made day by day. And you can see the pattern here, with Sonic 3 winning the days easily for the first few days after it opened, Mufasa taking the lead on Christmas Day, the day after Christmas, then Sonic coming back in to win its second weekend by just barely edging out Mufasa on a day-by-day basis. But look at New Year's here. Starting from January 1st to the 5th of January, which is the last day we're looking at grosses for, Mufasa has won every single day, which means that families are going out, which means that maybe Sonic 3 had a little bit more on the front end as far as demand. And so the question now is going to be whether Mufasa keeps up this pattern? Is it now going to start consistently out-earning Sonic 3? The fact that it started on New Year's Day and has continued to is an indication to me that it might have a little more gas left in the tank than Sonic. But the big question also is, kids are going back to school. What's the ratio going to be of people going to see Mufasa versus Sonic 3? But this has been one of the more interesting box office stories for me to follow towards the end of the year here. Again, if you just look at the results, it looks like Sonic 3 is running away with it, no pun intended, but Mufasa actually pacing out very well on a slower pace. It's not bad news for Sonic 3, though. This is the cumulative daily gross for the third film versus the second and first movie. And what you're not seeing, right now at least, is Sonic 3 starting to decline and lose a lead over Sonic the Hedgehog 2. It appears that it started quickly, but demand has kept up. So it's not like it was all fueled in the beginning and it's dropping closer to the previous film. So even though it is losing ground to Mufasa, it also looks like it is going to be the highest grossing Sonic film so far. So if you're Paramount, even if you do lose to Mufasa, ultimately, you still made a hit movie, and you've made a movie that is in higher demand than the previous one, and when you're building a franchise, that's what you want to do. I also don't want to overlook Nosferatu. It currently is the fourth highest grossing horror film released in 2024. It bypasses Smile 2 to take that number 4 spot, and it is within striking distance of Longlegs. If it can get to $105 million, it will be the second highest grossing horror film of the year, or at least that was released in 2024, bypassing Alien Romulus at $105.3 million. So we will keep tracking Nosferatu over the next few weeks. And also we have Wicked and Moana 2, which have been locked in their own battle. You can see how they've been switching places. Moana 2 opened that big lead with its Thanksgiving opening weekend, and then has flip-flopped with Wicked a couple of different times. Now, they haven't been out the same number of days. That's why Moana 2 doesn't quite match up with Wicked. But Moana 2 has held close enough. You see that there's a bit of a gap opening there. But if demand does keep falling for Wicked and Moana 2 can keep holding, then this could be a very close race to see which movie earns the most domestically. But again, it doesn't really matter, other than people who might want to have bragging rights for whichever movie they like better, because they're both hit films. As a matter of fact, when we look at the biggest hits of the year, I don't think it's much of a spoiler for me to say that both of these movies will appear on one of those lists. Before we look at the biggest theater count changes for this past weekend, there was one quick correction to the theater count changes from the weekend of December 27th. As often happens, Red One was a late reporting film, and it ended up losing the second most theaters in the weekend following Christmas. It lost 1,437 of them, the bulk of its theaters, to remain in 565. The rest of the list we already saw last week, with War of the Rohirrim leading the way with 1,467 theaters lost. And looking at the most theaters lost this past weekend, War of the Rohirrim once again leads the pack. It falls out of wide release. It lost 663 theaters. It's now in just 472. Kraven the Hunter is actually shedding theaters more slowly than I thought it would. It lost 575, but it's still in 1,862. Red One lost about half of its remaining theaters, 280 of them. It's now in 285. Bloody Axe Wound, which wasn't really given a huge release to begin with, lost almost all of its theaters. It is a horror film about a female slasher breaking into what has traditionally been a male-dominated industry. 219 theaters gone. It's now in 18. And then Mufasa the Lion King also lost 175 theaters. It's still in 3,925. My guess is a lot of those are theaters where it was booked for the Christmas holiday, maybe a lot of premium theaters that wanted to get the family crowd in. But there are movies like Nosferatu that picked up theaters this past weekend. So I think that a lot of those theater owners are saying, all right, we got the family audience. Now let's shift over. Let's get to the adult audience. Seven also came out in IMAX this past weekend. So that theater loss for Mufasa, my guess would be mostly premium IMAX screens that wanted to just optimize their weekend gross with another release. So this is a chart I said last week I wasn't sure what I was going to do with. This is our road to recovery, and many of you had some great suggestions. I've actually decided to keep this going for one more year because we would then have 5 years of data pre-pandemic and 5 years of data after the pandemic. So this is what the 2024 road to recovery looks like through the end of the year. You can see that through week 52, we were basically charting a course right between where we have been and where we were. But of course, we're at the end of the year. So what we need to do is take all of that data from 2024 and average that into that red line. So looking at the chart, the blue line is the weekend average for 2015 to 2019. The red line is the weekend average for 2021 to 2023. So let's add 2024's numbers in there. Let's clean up the chart a little bit first. We'll take the posters off. This is what the data looked like for the 2024 road to recovery. And when we take off the dotted line, which was the 2024 weekend by weekend number, we can see what the averages were before we add in 2024's data. But once we average everything in, this is what the new baseline looks for the road to recovery. And what we basically saw was that 2024 saw some advancement from pre-pandemic numbers. The averages went up, particularly in early June and late July, which was helped out by Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine, which is now added to that average for now 4 years of box office data. Wicked and Moana 2 also boosted the numbers right around Thanksgiving. But otherwise, we continue to lag behind pre-pandemic numbers. We lost some ground, really, in the early part of the year, the early summer, and the fall. I'm going to kind of do a quick side-by-side. So again, this is what the average data looked like before we put in the 2024 numbers. And this is what the average data looks like now. So that road to recovery is still ongoing because for much of the year, we were lagging somewhat behind the average pre-pandemic and in some cases significantly behind. And we've really only matched the numbers in a couple of places. Let's see what the first week of 2025 looks like. Now, I added 2 weeks of data just so you could see where we were basically between the two numbers. And you can see that we began the year pretty much as we ended it. The first week of 2025 was right between where we have been traditionally and where we were pre-pandemic. What we want to see this year is that black line staying much, much closer to the blue line than to the red line. 2025 is being hyped, and I think in reality is, barring some kind of unforeseen circumstance, the first normal year since 2019. 2020 obviously was the pandemic. 2021, 2022 were very much rebuilding years. We were looking good in 2023 until everything was basically derailed by the strikes. That spilled over into 2024. This year, 2025, is the first year where we have a robust, uninterrupted release schedule. And so we should get a good look at some of this data and see how we do with the first normal year in about 5 years. And to those of you that said that I should keep doing it, you know what? I think that's the right call. You made a good suggestion. That's why I like to ask you questions, because you're smart people and you're the ones that watch the show. You can tell me what you want. We usually do this a little bit later in the show, but I want to go ahead and look at some of the specialty charts because once we get into the biggest hits and flops of the year, I don't want to then loop back. Before we look at the per theater averages for this past weekend, again, one quick correction to the averages from December 27th to the 29th. Harbin was the second best grosser per theater for that weekend, bringing in $13,962 in 2 theaters. Harbin is a South Korean film set in the early 20th century about a group fighting Japan for the country's independence. Let's look now at the top per theater averages for this past weekend, and The Brutalist continues its streak. It expanded into 8 theaters and brought in just over $30,000 per theater. The Brutalist is going to be expanding into many more markets this upcoming weekend. Of course, it won the Golden Globe for Best Motion Picture Drama. Adrian Brody won for his performance. Brady Corbet won for Best Director. So this movie is very much in the Oscars conversation. Nickel Boys comes in second. It brought in $8,053 per theater in 18 theaters. It's also expanding release later this month. Pedro Almodovar's The Room Next Door brought in just over $8,000 in 6 theaters. And then we have 2 wide releases, Mufasa the Lion King at $5,977 per theater and Sonic the Hedgehog 3 at $5,702 per theater. Looking at the top films in limited release this past weekend, which is 1,000 theaters or fewer, 7 led the way. It was in 200 theaters with its 4K IMAX re-release. That brought in $915,000. In second place was The Damned in 732 theaters, which brought in about $769,000. This is a horror film from Iceland about a group of villagers during a harsh winter who find a shipwrecked crew. And given that it's a horror film from Iceland, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's pretty bleak. Harbin in 70 theaters, an expansion over the previous weekend, brought in just under $295,000. The Brutalist in 8 theaters brings in $244,000. And Flow, which had what I think would be an upset win at the Golden Globes for Best Animated Feature, comes in 5th place, bringing in $213,000 in 127 theaters. Well, we have transitioned from 2024 into 2025, and last week I asked those of you that are members here on the channel, of all of the big comic book movies that are coming out this year, which one are you most excited about? And it's good news for the Man of Steel, because the winner of this poll easily was Superman. 59% of channel members who voted in the poll said that Superman was the 2025 comic book movie they were most excited about, that they were most looking forward to. Fantastic Four: The First Steps was a distant second at 24%, followed by Thunderbolts at 10%, and maybe this is a precursor to a February box office performance that some have been a little bit worried about. Captain America: Brave New World comes in fourth place with just 7% of people voting, saying it was the movie that they were most excited about. We'll see if that bears out in the box office results negatively for Marvel and positively for DC. This week's member poll is about the month of January, traditionally not a very high-grossing month at the box office. But in the last decade, there have been 4 movies that were the highest grossing film of the month and grossed over $100 million domestically. So as we enter the January box office season, I'm asking the channel members to vote on this question: which of these $100+ million January grossers is your favorite? We have Kung Fu Panda 3, Split, Glass, and Bad Boys for Life, which made $100 million very shortly before theaters closed down for the pandemic back in 2020. So of the last decade, these are the 4 number 1 movies that grossed over $100 million in January. Which one of these is your favorite? If you are a channel member, you can go vote on that poll right now. If you're not a channel member, depending on how you're watching the show, there might be a button for you to join, or there's a link down in the description below. Once you become a member, you not only get to vote in these polls, but you also get things like early access to a lot of my videos. A lot of the stuff I did around the holidays went out early to channel members, and you get your own custom badges and emoji to use down in the chat. So I'd love to have you come and be a part of the channel and hear your voice on things like these polls. Looking outside the United States market this past weekend to the top 5 films internationally, at number 1 was Mufasa: The Lion King, which squeaked out a win at $53.5 million, just ahead of Sonic the Hedgehog 3 at $51.2 million, so mirroring what happened domestically. Nosferatu hit a lot of international markets. It brought in $26.8 million. Moana 2 comes in 4th place at $26 million, and then China's Octopus with Broken Arms rounds out the top 5 at $15.6 million. When you take those international numbers, you combine them with the domestic numbers, we get our top 5 films worldwide, and Mufasa: The Lion King leads the way. It brought in another $77.3 million, a 32.3% drop from its worldwide numbers the previous weekend. It's now close to $500 million worldwide. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 dropped 35.4% at $72.4 million. Its worldwide total is now at $336.3 million. Nosferatu had a 62.3% increase in business, again because it opened in a lot of international markets, bringing in $40 million total. Its worldwide gross is now over $100 million, an important milestone for Robert Eggers, which we're going to talk about. Moana 2 dropped 29.3%, bringing in another $38.3 million. It is knocking on the door of being the 3rd billion-dollar grosser of 2024. And Wicked comes in 5th place, dropping 36.7%. It's made $20.9 million for a worldwide total of $681.2 million. We've been looking at this chart for the past couple weeks regarding Mufasa as it tries to avoid being one of the biggest drop-offs between an original film that grossed $1+ billion and its direct sequel, and it has now avoided being 3rd place on the list. It will drop off less than Alice Through the Looking Glass did from Alice in Wonderland, so it won't be as big a drop-off as The Marvels or Joker Folie à Deux. It won't be as big a drop-off as Alice Through the Looking Glass, and if it can get to $636.5 million, it will avoid being 4th place on this list, which is currently held by Aquaman and The Lost Kingdom. So I will continue tracking Mufasa's worldwide gross in regards to that list. I mentioned that the $100 million milestone is important for Robert Eggers. That's because Nosferatu is his first ever movie to gross $100 million worldwide. It's also his highest grossing movie ever as a director, now both domestically and worldwide. It's at $100.3 million. That puts it ahead of The Northman, which topped out around $69.4 million. The Witch made $40.3 million, and The Lighthouse made $18.2 million. So Nosferatu doing very well for director Robert Eggers. So that's this past weekend. Let's look now at the box office year that was 2024, what the market looked like overall, and what some of the biggest hits and flops of the year were. Looking first of all at the domestic box office overall, we now have the final number, and 2024 brought in $8.559 billion. That's a little more than $300 million short of 2023's number. But honestly, when you look at where we were going into really the holidays, being off less than 5% from the previous year at the box office domestically, I think most people will take it. The fact that we still almost equaled 2023's box office despite the slew of disappointments that we saw through the first, let's say, 10 months of the year is pretty good. Now, again, with 2025 being a full domestic release year, nothing being pushed off the calendar, nothing being delayed, knock on wood, let's hope nothing happens. What we're looking to do in 2025 is to not only beat the 2024 number, but at least exceed it by a healthy margin. We want to get over $9 billion. I'm sure that Hollywood would be elated if we could get to $10 billion. That still wouldn't match where we were pre-pandemic, but it would at least get us closer. And that's what the whole road to recovery thing is. You don't want to stagnate. You want to try to keep recovering back to those pre-pandemic highs. Maybe we'll never hit them again, but we definitely want to get a lot closer than where we have been. This is the final box office market share by studio, where Disney was able to ride to a victory at 26.48% of all movie tickets sold in 2024. Universal was the second place studio at 22.2%. Last year, Universal was able to squeak out a win and be the number one studio domestically, but Disney wins by about 4%. So really a great push at the end of the year for Disney. Sony was pretty stagnant at 11%. That's basically where it was in 2023. Warner Brothers lost a couple percentage points. It brought in 13% of all ticket sales. Paramount, last of the quote-unquote 5 major studios, it brought in just 6.4% of all tickets sold. This is its second year in a row to come in at under 10% market share. And then all other studios, so all of the studios that aren't the majors, that aren't Lionsgate, Amazon, or the 5 traditional major studios, they actually had a 3% increase in market share from 2023, which means that a good number of people were going to see films from A24 and Neon and the other studios that aren't affiliated with the major corporations in the major studio system. So that's a nice little story for the smaller players out there as more people are drawn to their movies. But which movies of 2024 were the biggest hits and which ones were the biggest failures? Well, we have a few different ways to look at it. And let's start first of all by looking at the movies that had the best legs. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you take a movie's opening weekend in wide release. If it played in limited release, we basically start this when it hit 1,000 theaters. We look at what it opened to that weekend and then what its final gross was. How many times that opening weekend was its final gross? And what that tells us is what the drawing power of that movie was. How front-loaded was it, or how many people went out to see it after that opening weekend. And the movie that had the best legs of the year so far may surprise you because it was The Substance, which opened in wide release, which is kind of unusual for a movie of its size. Its final gross was 5.13 times its opening weekend, which means that it had the best staying power, again by percentage, not based on raw dollars, of any movie that played this year. Next up is Conclave, which also opened in wide release and brought in 4.76 times its opening weekend. So we have 2 Oscar dramas, 2 awards movies here. Next is Mufasa the Lion King, although keep in mind that Mufasa is still in wide release and is still earning money. I think that it's very likely that it could end up having the best legs of 2024 once everything's said and done. Right now, its total domestic gross is at 4.75 times its opening weekend number and growing. So I will keep track of this and update the chart as needed. In fourth place is The Forge, which was a faith-based drama. Its final gross was 4.37 times its opening weekend. And then coming in fifth was Inside Out 2, which had a massive opening weekend, but was also able to have a final domestic gross that was 4.23 times that opening weekend. That just goes to show you how popular that movie was. You don't often see a movie that opens that big and is able to pull in a multiplier that high. Despicable Me 4 gets honorable mention. It had a really good multiplier, but you had to discount a couple of days of box office before its opening weekend in order to get an accurate, I think, multiplier of just how much it brought in, and it just missed out the top 5. But I think it's interesting to look at the different movies here. A couple of family films, a couple of small budget films, Conclave, a medium budget movie, Mufasa and Inside Out 2, both big Disney movies. It just goes to show you why I enjoy looking at the box office from multiple angles, because it's not always the biggest movies necessarily that spell the most success across every metric. Of course, if we're going to look at the best legs, we have to look at the worst legs, and this may not surprise a lot of people, but Joker, Folie à Deux, had the worst legs of any wide release, and I should note that this is looking only at wide releases because I couldn't chase down every movie that was just in limited release. Joker, Folie à Deux had the worst legs of any wide release of 2024. It brought in just 1.55 times its opening weekend when you look at its final domestic gross. Boy Kills World is just behind Joker, Folie à Deux at 1.56 times its opening weekend. The A24 comedy Y2K is in third at just 1.78 times its opening weekend. Borderlands, which was a big box office bomb that we may be seeing again, brought in just 1.8 times its opening weekend. And then Afraid, remember that movie? It was barely in theaters, comes in fifth place with a final domestic gross of just 1.83 times its opening weekend. So we've looked at longevity. Let's look now at return on investment. How much did a movie cost and how much did it bring in? Now, I'm doing this based on worldwide numbers because I think it gives us a more complete picture. And we're going to look first at return on investment as far as pure dollars. What was the budget of a movie and how much has it brought in or did it bring in worldwide? And Inside Out 2 fairly easily takes the crown by this metric. It brought in nearly $1.5 billion more than its budget. Deadpool and Wolverine comes in second place at $1.1 billion more than its budget. Then we have Despicable Me 4, which was not a $1 billion movie, but was also not an expensive movie. It brought in $869 million more than its budget. Currently, Moana 2 is in fourth place with $810.9 million more worldwide than it costs to make. And Wicked comes in fifth place. Again, not a $1 billion grosser, but the movie had a reasonable production cost, and it's brought in over $500 million more than it cost to make. Now, this is different from the projections that I do based on my own calculations as far as profitability. So this doesn't include things like marketing costs and taking out the cuts for the theaters. This is just raw dollars. But again, it just gives you an idea of how much these movies were bringing in. However, it really shouldn't be any surprise that the biggest hits of the year are the highest earning films of the year. But what about return on investment as far as what percent of its budget a movie brought in? So if a movie cost not very much money and brought in even a moderate amount of money, it could do very well on this chart. And that's actually what we see with the biggest return on investment as far as percentage. Terrifier 3 earned back 3,817% of its budget. That is absolutely massive. And it did make $100 million worldwide, but it was made very inexpensively. It hit the right markets, and it is a huge return on the investment from Damien Leone. It was also basically an independent film. So it is the biggest return on investment when you're looking at it by percentage. Longlegs brought in 2,507% of its budget. Again, a very small production budget, and that's a movie that can bring in $50-70 million worldwide and still be a huge return on that investment. A lot of this is going back to legal fees, but It Ends With Us brought in 1,399% of its budget. The movie was made for a responsible sum of money and hit the market that it was going for. Late Night with the Devil is a movie that many people might be surprised to see here, but because it was so cheap to make, it brought in 1,030% of its overall budget, and it was in wide release. And then Despicable Me 4 comes in fifth place. Because they kept production costs down, it still brought in 969% of its budget. So when you look at the major studio films, you could make the case that Despicable Me 4 was the most important performance of the year because it didn't just bring in raw dollars, it brought in a great return on the budget that was put into it. Well, let's look at the flip side now. This is the worst return on investment for the year, aka what you might call the biggest flops. This is worldwide gross compared to budget in dollars. How much did it cost to make and how much did it earn worldwide? Megalopolis comes in at number one, about $108.2 million in the hole. That's negative $108.2 million from what Francis Ford Coppola reportedly invested in it. Now, this doesn't include whether rights were sold or any other income, but this is the hole that the movie found itself in. Right behind is Argylle at negative $103.7 million. Now, some would argue, and I have here on the show, that the $200 million budget for Argylle wasn't necessarily the budget for that movie specifically, but to acquire the intellectual property. But I would also make the argument that the intellectual property doesn't have a lot of value right now, depending on what rights Apple has to the Kingsman movies and if they plan to tie those into Apple Originals. So I think that this is still a pretty big loss for Apple. Again, it's a streaming service. I don't know what their financial model is, but looking at just money made versus money spent, Argylle just avoids. It's really just a Francis Ford Coppola flop away from being number one. Borderlands is at negative $82 million as far as what it costs versus what it made, and there's really no getting around that one. Fly Me to the Moon is another Apple release. It brought in $61.8 million less than it reportedly cost to make. And then Kraven the Hunter comes in at number 5. It so far has brought in $51.3 million less than it costs to make. And the margin there, I don't really think that there's much left for it to make. And the margin's big enough, I'm pretty confident it's going to stay in that number 5 spot. So these were all the biggest money losing movies just based on a cost return basis. Let's look at the worst return on investment when you compare its budget to its worldwide gross by percentage. And unfortunately, Megalopolis is still number one. Megalopolis brought in just 10% of its production budget worldwide. That is the smallest number of any measurable movie that I could find that opened in wide release. Next is The Book of Clarence. That was a January release from last year. It had a big all-star cast, a big soundtrack. It brought in just 16% of its production budget. I guess I couldn't get through 2024 without having to say the name of this movie one more time. The American Society of Magical Negroes comes in third place. It brought in just 17% of what it cost to make worldwide. Boy Kills World is a movie you could certainly put up with Megalopolis and Joker Folie à Deux as one of the biggest flops of the year across a few different metrics. It brought in just 18% of its budget. And then in fifth place is Elevation. What's Elevation, you say? It's a movie that barely got a wide release starring Anthony Mackie and Marina Baccarin about mountain aliens, I think. I don't know what rights to that movie were sold where, but on a box office level, it brought in just 18% of its production budget, which gets it to number 5 on the list. So if you're going to name a biggest hit and a biggest flop of the year, well, by percentage, the biggest hit of the year is easily Terrifier 3, which had an incredible return on its investment. If you're talking raw dollars, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's going to be Disney. Disney had $3 billion movies in 2024 when Moana 2 eventually hits that mark, the only $3 billion movies, and they all made a healthy amount of money. As far as the biggest flop of 2025, you have to say it's Megalopolis. Just based off of raw money lost, the percentage of the budget earned back, Joker Folie à Deux definitely up there, the worst legs of any movie in wide release of the year. And then Boy Kills World is a mid-budget film that you could say is among the biggest flops of the year. It just couldn't even make back the modest amount that was spent on it. And it was a Lionsgate release, as was Megalopolis. They picked up distribution for it in North America. Lionsgate having a truly atrocious year, or certainly had a truly atrocious year in 2024. I'd say they could hope for a better 2025, but it almost couldn't help but be better than the year that they just saw. So those were some of the biggest hits and flops of the year. This is what the 2024 annual domestic box office chart looks like as of now. Now we'll see how Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Mufasa the Lion King do in the next few weeks. They could both get onto this chart because $196 million is basically the threshold. But Inside Out 2 is the number one movie of 2024, followed by Deadpool and Wolverine. Wicked and Moana 2 are going to fight it out there, I think, for what's going to be number 3 and what's going to be number 4, but they are going to be the two movies in that slot. Despicable Me 4 is at number 5, followed by Beetlejuice, Dune Part 2, and Twisters. Currently, Godzilla Kong, The New Empire, and Kung Fu Panda 4 are the number 9 and number 10 movie of 2024, but we will keep counting revenue towards 2024 releases, so we'll see if they end up being the final two movies on that list. And of course, I will update this chart as it needs to be. Looking at the 2024 worldwide box office as it stands right now, again, Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine, number 1 and number 2 for the year. Currently, Despicable Me 4 is at number 3, although it will be passed by Moana 2 probably today or tomorrow, and then we will see Moana 2 become the third billion-dollar movie of the year, so Disney will own all $3 billion grossers. That's a big turnaround for them from 2023. Despicable Me 4 will land in 4th place, followed by Dune Part 2 in 5th place, although Wicked may come up and take that number 5 spot, depending on how much it's got left in the tank. Godzilla Kong the New Empire is currently at number 7, followed by Kung Fu Panda 4. Mufasa the Lion King, though, is at number 10. It'll bypass YOLO and be number 9. And then the real question is, can Sonic 3, I think that would be the movie that would have the shot, get to $480 million and make this an all-American top 10, basically, at the 2024 worldwide box office? I'm not entirely sure, but we'll see how it does. I think there's a few international markets where it has yet to open. It's a possibility, but even still, the U.S. is going to have a minimum of the top 9 out of 10 movies at the worldwide box office in 2024. And again, that's a good turnaround for the U.S. film industry because we haven't seen numbers like that in a while. This is another chart that I will continue to update as we get into 2025. This is the fall holiday box office. So these were movies that were released from Labor Day to the end of the year. Next week, I will start a 2025 winter-spring box office chart, which will basically track everything from the beginning of the year until the end of April. But Wicked is currently the number 1 movie at the fall holiday box office domestically, followed by Moana 2. Beetlejuice right now is in 3rd place. Sonic the Hedgehog 3, though, is moving up quickly to number 4. It's at 187.6, although I don't think it's going to get that $300 million threshold. Gladiator 2 moves down to number 5, although Mufasa the Lion King is hot on his trails. It's going to be number 5 basically by the end of today. The Wild Robot moves down 2 spots to number 7. Venom the Last Dance moves down 2 spots to number 8. Red 1 is in 9th place. It does not look like it's going to hit that $100 million mark domestically. And Nosferatu comes in now at 10th place on the fall holiday domestic chart. As a fan of that film and horror movies that challenge the audience and are very artistic, I am happy to see Nosferatu on this chart at all. This is a look at the 2025 annual domestic box office. This is the calendar year. So this is all tickets sold beginning on January 1 and what the top grossing movies of the year are. And it's no surprise they're all 2024 movies because nothing's really been released in 2025. So as the year progresses, we'll look at this and we'll look at the actual 2025 release chart for the year. Currently, Mufasa the Lion King is the highest earning movie of the year. We saw that daily gross and that Mufasa had been number 1 every day since January 1st. It's currently the highest grosser of the year domestically. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is in 2nd at $36.1 million. Moana 2, we've mentioned, has been closing the gap between Wicked. It's currently the 3rd highest grossing film of the year at $21.1 million. Nosferatu is almost tied, basically, with Moana 2. At number 4, Wicked's at $17.5 million at number 5, and then we have A Complete Unknown, Baby Girl, Gladiator 2, Homestead, and The Fire Inside. This largely mirrors the box office top 10 right now because those are the 10 movies that people are going to see. And that wraps up our look at 2024 and the biggest hits and flops. Before we go, I want to take a look at the latest in the streaming world because we had another big debut on Netflix, which was Squid Game 2. It debuted the day after Christmas, and it was not only a big debut for Netflix, it was the biggest debut of the year for Netflix. These are the numbers for December 23rd through the 29th. New numbers will be released later today. They may be out by the time this show is released. Squid Game Season 2, and remember, it was only out for a partial amount of this week, brought in 68.04 million views, almost 500 million hours watched. We'll see how it does in the weeks ahead, but so far, no drop-off for the show that was a follow-up to Netflix's most-watched program ever. That would be Squid Game Season 1. Carry On put up another great number, 34.9 million views. This has been a huge success story for Netflix. The 688 brought in 23.27 million views. Then we have a pair of NFL games, and Netflix is getting into live events. We'll see how WWE does next week when we look at those numbers. Ravens versus Texans brought in 14.41 million views, and Chiefs versus Steelers brought in 14.31 million views to round out the top 5. La Palma comes in 6th place, followed by That Christmas, The Grinch, and Virgin River Season 6. And Squid Game is so popular that Squid Game Season 1 was one of Netflix's most popular programs of the week at just over 8 million views. And as I mentioned, Squid Game 2 was the biggest Netflix debut of the year, and it wasn't even close. 68.04 million views easily beats the Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight, which debuted at 46.64 million views. Bridgerton Season 3 gets bumped down to number 3, followed by Carry On, which debuted to 42 million views, and Beverly Hills Cop Axel F at 41.05 million views. And this will pretty much be the list for 2024 in general. Looking at Netflix as far as weekly views, whether it was a debut week or not, again, Squid Game Season 2 easily captures this by about 13 million views. Carry On, which had the record for just 1 week, is now in second place. It brought in 55 million views in its second week of release. Then we have Damsel in its second week at 50 million views, the Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight at 46.64 million views, and the debut of Bridgerton Season 3 at just over 45 million views. When we look at the most watched movies on Netflix in 2024, Carry On is at number 2 at 132 million views, and the way that I'm going to do this is similar to the box office. If a movie or show that was released on Netflix in 2024 continues to get views, then I will update the 2024 chart until it drops off of the chart. So even though a lot of the views for Carry On that might take it past Damsel for number 1 might have come in 2025, it was still released in 2024. So I'm going to continue to update this chart, and then I'll make a new one for new movies and shows that are released in 2025. But it does look like Carry On is going to take the crown as the most watched movie on Netflix in 2024. The Union drops down to number 3, Rebel Ridge drops down to 4, Under Paris drops down to 5, Lift drops down to number 6, Society of the Snow drops down to number 7, Lindsay Lohan's Our Little Secret comes up to number 8 at 80.2 million views. That drops A Family Affair down to 9, and Beverly Hills Cop Axel F down to number 10. Looking at the most watched shows on Netflix in 2024, this is just how big Squid Game Season 2's debut was. In just a few days, it's already become the 5th most watched show of the year on Netflix at 68.04 million views. The Gentleman Season 1 is at number 4, Baby Reindeer is at number 3, Fool Me Once is at number 2, and Bridgerton Season 3 is at number 1. But it seems assured that maybe just with the second week numbers that Squid Game Season 2 is going to be number 1 on this list. The Perfect Couple, Monsters, Lyle and Eric Menendez, and Griselda all moved down 1 spot. Avatar: The Last Airbender Season 1 is at number 9, and La Palma enters the chart as the 10th most watched Netflix show of 2024 with 50 million views. And then looking at the most watched Netflix programs overall for 2024, Carry On is the second most watched movie or show of the year, just behind Damsel, although Squid Game 2 I think is going to rapidly ascend to this list. Bridgerton Season 3 gets moved down to 3rd, followed by The Union and Rebel Ridge. Baby Reindeer currently hanging out at number 10, but it is going to get knocked off the list. It will not be one of the 10 most watched Netflix programs of the year, but still a very good show. It just won a couple of Golden Globes. Let's take a look now at the Nielsen ratings. Now, these lag a little bit behind Netflix. This is for the week of November 25th through December 1st. It's because Nielsen just releases the data a little bit later. They've got a lot of data and numbers to crunch. Let's look first at the most watched streaming movies for November 25th through December 1st. So this is right around Thanksgiving. Our Little Secret's debut on Netflix comes in at number 1 with 17.4 million hours watched. Keep in mind, this is domestic streaming numbers only, not worldwide, like the ones we were just looking at. Elf, a holiday favorite, re-enters the chart at number 2 with 12.25 million hours watched. Moana on Disney Plus is at number 3. No surprise, this was right around the time of Moana 2's release. Spellbound on Netflix debuts at number 4 with just over 11 million hours watched. Then we have The Grinch at number 5, Home Alone at number 6, Peacock's Dear Santa debuting at number 7 at 9.1 million hours watched, Deadpool and Wolverine at number 8, Twisters at number 9, and then National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation rounding out the top 10 with 6.4 million hours watched. And it really shouldn't be much of a surprise that Moana, due to the surge in viewership around Moana 2's release, has recaptured the crown as the most watched streaming movie of the year in the US, according to Nielsen. The Super Mario Bros. Movie had that title for several months, but Moana is now at number 1 for the year. Mario Brothers is now number 2. Inside Out 2, Damsel, and Trolls Band together round out the top 5. Looking at the most watched streaming shows for November 25th through December 1st, at number 1 was the debut of Colman Domingo show in The Madness at 21.4 million hours watched, followed by Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenet Ramsey at 19.1 million hours watched. Bluey comes in third, followed by Bob's Burgers and A Man on the Inside. Grey's Anatomy, Cross, Family Guy, and Lost are all holdovers in the top 10 at number 6 through 9. And Landman on Paramount Plus enters the top 10 at 11.2 million hours watched. Cross, which is a TV adaptation of the Alex Cross stories, has done really well on Amazon so far. It's actually their 10th most watched program ever since Nielsen began reporting numbers in 2020. It's bumped The Summer I Turned Pretty down to number 10. When you look at this, though, we've got, I think, more Wheel of Time this year. We've got more Reacher coming out this year, so we could see a lot more movement on this list in 2025. Looking at the top streaming shows from November 25th to December 1st, as far as watch time per available episode, how many hours was a show watched and how many episodes is it? Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenet Ramsey, comes in at 6.39 million hours watched per episode. That is a big number. We'll see just how big in just a second. Landman comes in second place at 2.82 million hours watched per episode. The Madness brought in 2.68 million hours per episode, and A Man on the Inside brought in just under 2 million watched hours per episode. Then we have Cross rounding out the top 5, followed by Special Ops Lioness, The Empress, The Lincoln Lawyer, Yellowstone, and Cobra Kai. There's a lot of Taylor Sheridan on this chart. And I mentioned that Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenet Ramsey, had a big watch time per episode number. It actually had the best number as far as hours watched per episode of the year. 6.39 million is able to bump Fool Me Once, which had the number 1 spot since the first week of 2024, down to number 2. American Nightmare is in third place. Fallout is in fourth place. And Testament, the story of Moses, now rounds out the top 5. And that does it for this numbers-packed episode of Charts with Dan. It's always a big show at the end of the year. There are a few things coming out this week on streaming and on theaters that I wanted to bring to your attention in case you're interested. First of all, starting on Thursday, The Traitors Season 3, which I believe is now an Emmy-winning show, debuts on Peacock. Then we have several things available on Friday. First of all, opening in theaters, the first major release of 2025, Den of Thieves 2 Pantera. I actually enjoyed the first one quite a bit, so I'll be checking the second one out in theaters. Also opening in some theaters around the country is Donnie Yen's film The Prosecutor, which we talked about in the international box office segment a couple of weeks ago. In theaters on Friday as well is Game Changer, a Telugu language action film from India about one man taking on political corruption. The movie stars RRR's Ram Charan. Entering wide release, I think there's been some talk that Paramount might be pulling back because the movie has done so poorly in limited release, is the Robbie Williams as a CGI ape biopic Better Man. I've actually heard good things. I'm going to try to check this one out. The Brutalist, which is a big Oscar contender, will be expanding into several major markets this upcoming weekend. Also expanding is Hard Truths, which features a fantastic performance from Marianne Jean-Baptiste. She is a Dark Horse Oscar contender, and she's also very good in the film. Speaking of actresses that are very good in the film, The Last Showgirl will also be expanding into more markets this weekend. Pamela Anderson gives a very good performance in this movie. And then hitting streaming on Friday is Goosebumps Season 2, The Vanishing, which will be available on Disney Plus and Hulu, and you can watch the full season starting on Friday. And that's all I got for you this week. Be sure to stay tuned right here on the channel. Awards season is heating up. There's lots of nominations and award shows coming up, and I'll be right here to cover those, as well as box office and movie news and reviews and everything else you know that I do here. Thank you so much for tuning in to this wrap-up of 2024. Here's to a great 2025 for Hollywood. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.